The most dangerous thing ever served at my table was not on a plate, I told myself later. It was hidden inside a folder. At 72 years old, I thought I understood the people I loved. I thought I knew the rhythm of my family, the familiar smiles, the stories repeated every holiday, the comfortable certainty that comes from decades spent raising children and building a home. That Saturday evening began exactly the way I wanted. I spent most of the afternoon preparing dinner. The dining room table was set with my best china. Candles flickered softly beside a bouquet of fresh flowers. A roast rested in the oven. The scent filled the house and brought back memories of holidays when my husband was still alive. For a few hours, I allowed myself to feel grateful. My son David arrived first. He kissed my cheek and carried in a pie from a local bakery. A few minutes later, Claire walked through the front door with Sophie beside her. My granddaughter immediately disappeared upstairs to check on a school project she had left at my house earlier in the week. Everyone seemed relaxed. Everyone seemed normal. Looking back, that was what made the evening so unsettling. Nothing appeared wrong. We laughed through dinner. We shared stories. David talked about work. Sophie talked about school. Claire smiled often and spoke kindly. If there were cracks in the picture, I could not see them. Not yet. After dessert, Claire stood and lifted her wine glass. "I would like to make a toast," she said. The room grew quiet. I smiled and lifted my own glass. "To family," I said. Claire smiled back. "To family," she replied. Then she reached down beside her chair and picked up a thin leather folder. At first, I assumed it contained photographs or perhaps plans for an upcoming vacation. Instead, she placed it directly in the center of the table. The sound it made against the wood seemed unusually loud. David immediately looked away. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the folder. Not Claire. My son. He suddenly became interested in the candle beside him. Claire folded her hands. "Eleanor," she said gently, "I think it is time we discussed your future." The words settled over the room like a cold fog. My smile faded. Sophie looked confused. David remained silent. Claire slowly opened the folder and turned it toward me. Several pages were clipped neatly together. Legal documents, property information, financial estimates. I felt my stomach tighten. "What is this?" I asked. Claire's expression never changed. "We have been researching retirement communities," she said, "and we believe selling this house would be the best decision." I looked at David. He still would not meet my eyes. Then I noticed a signature on one of the pages. His signature. In that moment, the dinner ended. The real story had just begun. For several seconds, nobody moved. The candles continued burning. The dishes remained on the table. Somewhere upstairs, I could hear Sophie walking across the floor. The ordinary sounds of a family evening suddenly felt very far away. I lowered my eyes to the papers again. The words blurred together for a moment. Retirement options. Property valuation. Recommended timeline. Proposed sale. The language was polite. Professional. Carefully prepared. "How long have you been working on this?" I asked. Claire folded her hands neatly in front of her. "A few months," she said. David still would not look at me. That answer hurt more than the folder itself. A few months. While I invited them for holidays. While I attended Sophie's school events. While I baked birthday cakes and listened to stories about work. They had been planning my future without ever discussing it with me. "And you never thought to ask what I wanted?" I said quietly. Claire offered a patient smile. It was the same smile she used whenever she explained something to a child. "We are thinking about what is best for you." I glanced toward David. "Are you?" He shifted in his chair. "Mom, please do not make this difficult." The words landed harder than I expected. I had spent 44 years raising that man. I remembered teaching him to ride a bicycle, sitting beside hospital beds when he was sick, working extra hours after my husband passed away so he could attend college without worrying about money. And now he was asking me not to make this difficult. Sophie appeared at the doorway just then. She looked from face to face. "Did I miss something?" she asked. Claire immediately stood. "Nothing important, sweetheart." Sophie frowned. Even at 16, she was smart enough to recognize tension when she saw it. She returned upstairs slowly, clearly unconvinced. The moment she disappeared, Claire sat back down. "Eleanor, this house is too much responsibility." I looked around the dining room. The hardwood floors. The framed photographs. The grandfather clock that had belonged to my father. Every corner held memories. "It has been my responsibility for 30 years, I replied. "And I have managed just fine." Claire opened another page. You could move into a beautiful community with activities and support. I noticed something then. She spoke about the house constantly. Not me. The house. The property. The value. The sale. Her focus seemed strangely narrow. I reached for the documents and began turning pages myself. Claire looked surprised. Perhaps she expected me to refuse. Perhaps she expected tears. Instead, I read carefully. Then I noticed a figure listed near the bottom of one page. A financial estimate. My eyes narrowed. Something about it felt wrong. Not impossible, just wrong. I closed the folder and looked directly at Claire. For the first time that evening, her confidence faltered. Because I had just seen the first crack in a plan she believed was perfect. After they left that night, I carried the folder into my study and closed the door. The house felt unusually quiet. The dishes had been washed. The candles had burned down to small pools of wax. Yet the evening remained with me, lingering in every room. I sat at my desk and began reading the documents again. This time I was not looking at them as a mother. I was looking at them as someone who had managed household finances for decades. Numbers tell stories. Most people simply do not know how to listen. The proposed sale price appeared reasonable at first glance. The projected expenses seemed ordinary. The retirement community brochures were polished and attractive. Everything had been assembled carefully, almost too carefully. Around midnight, I reached the final page again and paused. There was a reference number attached to one of the financial projections. It was small, easy to overlook. I copied it onto a notepad and continued reading. The more I examined the paperwork, the more uncomfortable I became. Certain estimates did not match local market conditions. Certain fees appeared unusually high. Individually, none of it proved anything. Together, they created a feeling I could not ignore. By the following morning, I had made a decision. Instead of confronting Claire, I called an old friend. Margaret Reed and I had known each other for more than 30 years. She had worked in banking before retiring and possessed an extraordinary memory for details. If something was wrong, she would see it. We met at a small coffee shop downtown. I placed the folder on the table between us. Margaret adjusted her reading glasses and began reviewing the pages. For nearly 20 minutes, she said very little. That alone made me nervous. Finally, she looked up. "Who prepared this?" she asked. "Claire brought it to dinner," I replied. Margaret tapped one of the pages. "These numbers are strange." My stomach tightened. "Strange how?" She turned the document toward me. "This estimate assumes values that do not align with comparable properties in your area." I stared at the figures. Could it be a mistake? Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Maybe. But if it is a mistake, there are several of them." We continued reviewing the paperwork together. Then she stopped on a page I had barely noticed. A financial account was listed as part of a future management plan. The account number was partially hidden, but enough remained visible to raise questions. Margaret frowned. "Do you recognize this?" I shook my head. "No," she studied it again. "You should find out who does." Later that afternoon, I returned home carrying more questions than answers. As I stepped onto my front porch, I noticed an envelope tucked beneath the doormat. There was no stamp, no return address, just my name written neatly across the front. I opened it immediately. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing one sentence. "Eleanor, before you sign anything, look at the account ending in 7824. Then I noticed something else. Whoever sent the message already knew about the folder. I read the note 3 times before stepping inside and locking the front door. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The message was brief, yet it carried the kind of certainty that immediately changes the way a person thinks. Someone knew about the documents. Someone knew about the account. More importantly, someone wanted me to find it. I carried the note into my study and placed it beside the folder. For the next hour, I compared every page again. Eventually, I found the reference. Account ending in 7824. It appeared only once, buried in a section most people would never read carefully. There was no explanation attached to it. No name. No institution. Just a number. The following morning, I called Margaret. She arrived before lunch carrying a notebook and a determination I had always admired. We spread everything across the dining room table. Financial projections, property estimates, retirement brochures, the anonymous note. Margaret examined the account reference again. "This does not belong here," she said quietly. "What do you mean?" I asked. She tapped the page. "The rest of this proposal discusses your future expenses. This account appears connected to fund transfers." My pulse quickened. Transfers to who? She shook her head. That is the question. We spent hours reviewing details. By mid-afternoon, a pattern began emerging. Certain figures repeated throughout multiple pages. Certain projections appeared designed to justify moving money from one place to another. Nothing proved wrongdoing. Not yet. But the documents no longer looked like a simple retirement plan. They looked like part of a larger strategy. That evening, David called. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "How are you doing, Mom?" he asked. "Fine," I answered. Still reading. A brief silence followed. "Claire is worried that you took the proposal the wrong way." I looked out the window toward the backyard my husband and I had spent years maintaining together. Did I? Another pause. "She only wants what is best for you." The sentence sounded rehearsed. I had heard it before. "David," I said gently, "have you personally reviewed every page?" His hesitation answered before he did. "Not every page." After we ended the call, I sat quietly for several minutes. My son trusted Claire completely. That much was obvious. Whether that trust was deserved remained unclear. The next day, Margaret called with surprising news. Through a former colleague, she had identified the financial institution connected to the mysterious account. She could not access private information, but she had learned enough to raise serious concerns. "Eleanor," she said carefully, "the account appears connected to a business entity." I frowned. "A business?" "Yes." "Whose business?" Her voice lowered. "That is where things become interesting." Later that afternoon, she arrived carrying printed records obtained through public filings. We sat together at my kitchen table. Margaret slid the papers toward me. Near the top of the first page was a company name I had never seen before. Beneath it was a list of registered individuals. My eyes moved slowly down the page. Then they stopped. There, among the names associated with the business, was Claire Hayes. And beside her name was a financial address linked directly to an account ending in 7824. In that moment, the proposal stopped looking like concern. It started looking like something else entirely. For the next several days, I told no one what Margaret and I had discovered. Not David. Not Claire. Not even Sophie. Some truths require patience before they can be revealed. I spent that week behaving exactly as everyone expected. I answered phone calls. I attended church on Sunday. I smiled during family conversations. Most importantly, I allowed Claire to believe her plan was working. On Wednesday afternoon, she called and invited me to dinner at her house. Her voice sounded unusually warm. "We would love to spend more time together," she said, "and maybe continue our conversation." I accepted immediately. The silence on the other end of the line lasted just a fraction too long. Claire had expected resistance. Instead, she received cooperation. When Friday evening arrived, I drove to their house carrying a pie and a notebook hidden inside my purse. The atmosphere felt almost identical to the dinner at my own home. The table was beautifully prepared. Candles glowed softly. Sophie chatted about school. David seemed relaxed. Claire smiled constantly. Yet now I noticed things I had missed before. Every conversation eventually drifted back toward the future. Every future seemed to involve me leaving my home. "You would love the community we found," Claire said while serving dessert. "There are walking trails, activities, and wonderful neighbors." I nodded politely. "It sounds lovely." Her eyes brightened. David smiled with relief. They interpreted my calmness as agreement. That was exactly what I wanted. Later, while Sophie cleared dishes, Claire brought out another folder. This one was thicker than the first. "I thought you might like to review some additional information," she said. I accepted it without hesitation. Inside were brochures, financial summaries, and several pages discussing property management. Then I noticed something familiar. The same company name Margaret had discovered appeared twice in the paperwork. Small print. Easy to miss. My pulse remained steady, but my confidence grew. Claire either believed I would never read the details or assumed I would never understand them. She was wrong on both counts. "You have done a lot of research," I said. Claire smiled proudly. "I only want what is best for our family." Family. The word lingered in my thoughts. Because by then I had begun to suspect this was never about protecting family. It was about controlling assets. As the evening ended, David walked me to my car. "Mom," he said quietly, "thank you for being open-minded." I looked at my son and felt a familiar ache. He still believed this was about care and concern. He still trusted every explanation he had been given. "David," I said gently, "have you ever asked why Claire's company appears in these documents?" The color drained from his face. What company? He asked. I stared at him for several seconds. The confusion in his eyes was genuine. Then I realized something important. Claire had not been hiding information only from me. She had been hiding information from David as well. Early the next morning, I called Margaret and told her everything David had said. She listened quietly until I finished. If he truly did not know about the company, she said, then we may be dealing with two different stories. The one Claire told you and the one Claire told him. That possibility stayed with me all day. For the first time since this began, I started wondering whether David was being manipulated as much as I was. Late that afternoon, Margaret arrived carrying a folder of her own. We sat in my kitchen while sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor. Without saying a word, she opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. Public business records, registration filings, financial disclosures. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just facts. Yet facts have a way of becoming dramatic when placed beside a lie. Look here, Margaret said. I adjusted my glasses and leaned closer. The company connected to account ending in 7824 had been formed almost 3 years earlier. Claire's name appeared repeatedly throughout the paperwork. What caught my attention was the timing. The company had been established long before anyone mentioned retirement communities, property sales, or concerns about my future. This was planned years ago, I whispered. Margaret nodded slowly. At the very least, she has been building something for years. I stared at the dates. 3 years. During those years, Claire attended birthdays, holidays, graduation ceremonies, and family dinners. During those same years, she had apparently been creating a business structure connected to the proposal sitting in my study. The realization left me unsettled. Not because of the company itself. People start businesses every day. It was the secrecy that troubled me. That evening, David called again. His voice sounded different. Less certain. Mom, he said, can we meet tomorrow? I immediately knew something had changed. Of course. We agreed to meet at a small park near my neighborhood the following morning. When I arrived, David was already sitting on a bench beneath a large oak tree. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles beneath his eyes. He had not slept much. Neither had I. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he reached into his jacket and handed me a document. I found this in Claire's office, he said quietly. My heart began to race. The document appeared to be an internal business proposal. Several pages described future acquisitions, property transfers, and management fees. One section contained projected revenue estimates. Another contained references to residential assets. Then I saw it. My address. The house where I had lived for 3 decades. The house where I raised my son. The house Claire insisted was too much responsibility for me. David looked away. She never showed me that version, he said. The disappointment in his voice was impossible to miss. I carefully folded the document and returned it to him. What are you going to do? I asked. He stared at the ground for several seconds before answering. I do not know. Then his phone vibrated. A message appeared on the screen. I watched his expression change as he read it. It is Claire, he said. She wants to host another family dinner next week. A chill moved through me, because after everything we had discovered, I suddenly knew exactly why Claire wanted everyone back at the same table. The invitation arrived 3 days later. Claire sent it through a family group message, complete with cheerful language and smiling emojis. Anyone reading it would have assumed she was planning an ordinary gathering. A family dinner. Good food. Time together. Nothing unusual. Yet by then, I understood something I had not seen before. The danger was never in dramatic moments. It lived inside ordinary ones. It hid behind smiles, polite conversations, and carefully chosen words. The following week passed slowly. Margaret continued helping me organize documents. David remained quiet. We spoke several times, but every conversation felt different now. The certainty he once carried had disappeared. In its place was doubt, not just about Claire, but about the version of reality he had accepted for years. On Thursday afternoon, he stopped by my house unexpectedly. We sat in the kitchen drinking coffee while sunlight filtered through the window. I confronted her, he said suddenly. I looked up. About the company? He nodded. She said it was a side business. And did you believe her? David stared into his cup. I wanted to. The answer broke my heart. Not because it was surprising, because it was honest. Love has a way of making people overlook details they would question in anyone else. Then what happened? I asked. He exhaled slowly. She became angry when I asked about the documents. That detail caught my attention immediately. Innocent people usually answer questions. They do not become defensive when facts appear. David continued. Then she told me I was overreacting and that everything she did was for the family. The family. I had heard those words many times. They sounded noble, generous, protective. Yet every document we discovered seemed to point toward something else entirely. Later that evening, after David left, I sat alone in my study reviewing everything one final time. The anonymous note, the business filings, the account information, the proposal connecting my home to Claire's company. Piece by piece, the picture had become clear. Then another realization struck me. For months, perhaps years, I had focused on the paperwork itself. But the paperwork was not the poison. The business was not the poison. The account was not the poison. Those were only symptoms. The real poison was much harder to see. It was the gradual belief that other people's lives could be managed without their knowledge. It was the assumption that control was the same thing as care. It was the willingness to disguise personal ambition as concern. Once I understood that, everything changed. On Saturday morning, I called Claire myself. She sounded surprised to hear from me. I just wanted to confirm dinner, I said pleasantly. Her voice immediately brightened. Of course. And I would like everyone there, I added. Everyone. A brief silence followed. What do you mean? She asked. I smiled even though she could not see me. I mean, everyone should hear the truth. The line went quiet. Not for long. Just long enough. Long enough for me to know she finally realized something she had never expected. I was no longer reacting to her plan. I was preparing my own. Saturday evening arrived with an unusual sense of calm. The sky was clear. The air was cool. As I drove to David and Claire's house, I felt none of the anxiety that had followed me through the previous weeks. Doubt had been replaced by certainty. Questions had been replaced by evidence. For the first time since that first folder appeared on my dining room table, I knew exactly where I stood. When I entered the house, everything looked perfect. The dining room was beautifully arranged. Candles flickered softly. Fresh flowers decorated the center of the table. Claire greeted everyone with a warm smile that seemed carefully practiced. David stood nearby, polite but distant. Sophie moved between the kitchen and dining room, carrying serving dishes, unaware that the evening would be remembered long after the meal itself was forgotten. I noticed Claire watching me closely. She wanted to know whether I had changed my mind, whether I had accepted her version of events, whether I was finally ready to cooperate. Instead, I smiled and thanked her for the invitation. Throughout dinner, conversation remained light. School, weather, local events. Claire laughed easily. David participated when necessary. Yet beneath every word, tension lingered. Everyone could feel it. Nobody acknowledged it. After dessert, Claire stood and lifted her glass. I would like to thank everyone for being here tonight, she said. Family means everything to me. The words hung in the air. I watched David lower his eyes. Claire continued speaking about the future, about making responsible decisions, about ensuring stability for everyone. Then she sat down and looked directly at me. Eleanor, have you had time to think about the proposal? The room became quiet. Even Sophie stopped moving. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. Yes, I said. I have. Claire smiled. And I reached beside my chair and lifted a large envelope. Her smile disappeared immediately. David noticed the change. So did I? Before I answer, I said calmly, I think there are a few things everyone should see. Claire's posture stiffened. What things? She asked. I removed several documents and placed them on the table. Business registrations, financial filings, property projections, public records. Nothing dramatic, just facts. I slid one page toward David. He stared at it silently. Then another. Then another. The color gradually faded from his face. Across the table, Claire remained perfectly still. I spent weeks trying to understand why my home appeared in documents connected to a company I had never heard of, I said. Then I learned the company belonged to someone I trusted. Sophie looked from one adult to another, confused by the growing silence. David slowly turned another page. Claire, he said quietly, why is my mother's address listed here? No one spoke. The candles flickered gently between us. Finally, Claire inhaled deeply. For the first time all evening, she seemed unable to find the right words. And in that moment, everyone at the table realized the conversation was no longer about retirement. It was about the truth. Claire looked around the table as though searching for an escape that did not exist. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. David continued staring at the documents in front of him. Sophie remained frozen in her chair, confused and concerned. I sat quietly and allowed the facts to speak for themselves. Eventually, Claire folded her hands and exhaled slowly. "It is not what it looks like," she said. The sentence felt familiar. People often say it when they realize appearances and reality have finally collided. David looked up. "Then explain it." His voice was calm, but the disappointment behind it was impossible to miss. Claire glanced at him before lowering her eyes. "The company was supposed to help families manage property transitions," she said. "I thought it could become a business opportunity." David lifted another page. "Then why was Mom's house already included in the projections?" Claire did not answer immediately. That hesitation told its own story. For weeks I had been searching for evidence of hidden transactions and secret plans. Now I understood something much simpler. The problem was never a single document. It was a mindset. Somewhere along the way, Claire had stopped seeing my home as my home. She had started seeing it as an asset, a future project, a financial opportunity. "I never intended to hurt anyone," she finally said. And for the first time all evening, I believed her. Not because her choices were justified, because her expression revealed something different from malice. It revealed rationalization. She had convinced herself that control was the same thing as helping, that deciding for others was acceptable if she believed the outcome was beneficial. David leaned back in his chair. "You never told me about the company," he said quietly. "You never told me about the projections." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "Because I knew you would misunderstand." "No," David replied. "You hid it because you knew I would ask questions." The room fell silent again. Sophie looked between her parents, slowly realizing that this conversation had been building long before tonight. After several moments, I stood and lifted my glass. Everyone turned toward me. "I would like to make a toast," I said. My voice remained steady. Not to winning, not to being right. I looked at each person around the table. To truth. The words settled gently over the room. "Because families survive mistakes," I continued. "They survive disagreements. They even survive disappointment. What they cannot survive is secrecy that grows year after year." Claire wiped her eyes. David remained silent. Sophie listened carefully. "This house is not for sale," I said. "Not today. Not tomorrow. Not because someone else decided it would be convenient." Then I smiled. "And if the day ever comes when I choose something different, that decision will belong to me." No one argued. No one needed to. The matter was settled. As the evening came to an end, I looked around the table one final time. The poison had never been hidden in food, paperwork, or bank accounts. It had been hidden in assumptions, in quiet ambitions, in decisions made without consent. And once the truth was finally served, its power disappeared. I left that dinner with my home, my independence, and something even more valuable. I left with the certainty that my voice still belonged to me.